I'm going to Chicago. With Jade.
Okay. Okay.
Camille. He said her name the wrong way. Soft, apologetic. The way he only said it when he was about to do something that could not be undone. She had been watching the departure board. Gate C7, Meridian Airways, destination Miami. 2:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late October. The terminal smelled like recycled air and fast food and the particular exhaustion of people who had somewhere to be. She had her carry-on beside her, her good tote bag on her shoulder, and her hand resting on the curve of her stomach the way it always rested now, the way she did not even notice anymore. She turned toward his voice. Sterling Devante Pierce was standing 3 feet away from her. He was wearing the charcoal blazer she had picked out for him in September, the one that made his shoulders look like a promise. He was holding his phone in his left hand and his expression in both of them, and she knew before she heard another word. She knew the way you know when the doctor's face changes before they speak. She knew the way her grandmother had always said you know. The body knows first. The mind catches up later if you let it. Jade Brooks was standing 10 feet behind him, near the window that looked out onto the tarmac, 2 rolling suitcases beside her. Corporate gray blazer, pressed beautiful in the careful way of a woman who had thought about being seen today. She looked at Camille once. Then she looked away. She looked out at the planes. She did not look back, Sterling said. There is something I should have handled differently. Camille said nothing. He said, and I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him. She was 7 months pregnant. She was wearing the caramel wrap dress he had bought her in July for her birthday, because it was the only thing that still felt like her body and not a landscape someone else was moving through. Her feet hurt. Her lower back had been a slow, steady complaint since morning. She had a Howard University Alumni Foundation Board meeting in Miami at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and she had printed her notes and tucked them into the front pocket of her carry-on, and she had kissed Sterling goodbye in the kitchen at 10 that morning and told him to eat something real for dinner. He had said, of course, baby. He had kissed her on the temple. He reached for her hand now. She stepped back. It was not dramatic. It was not a performance. She simply moved her hand out of the space where his was going and looked at him and waited. He said, I am going to Chicago with Jade. The terminal noise continued. A child was crying somewhere behind her. The departure board clicked and shuffled. Someone's rolling suitcase scraped past. He said, I am sorry. I did not want you to find out this way. He picked up Jade's bag, the larger one. He lifted it like he had done it before, efficiently and without hesitation, and he settled the strap onto his shoulder. He said, I will call you tonight. We will figure out the details. And then he walked away. He did not look back. Camille stood in the middle of gate C7 with her carry-on and her 7-month belly and the notes for a board meeting in the front pocket and watched her husband walk across the terminal with another woman's luggage on his shoulder. Her feet hurt. Her lower back ached. The child somewhere behind her was still crying. Beverly Tolliver was 44 years old. She was a 7th-grade English teacher from Memphis, Tennessee, waiting for the 4:15 flight to Nashville. She had been texting her daughter about dinner. She had not meant to record anything. But when she looked up and saw a very pregnant woman standing absolutely still in the middle of a busy terminal while a man walked away from her without looking back, she had lifted her phone. She had caught the last 40 seconds, Sterling walking, Jade falling into step 2 paces behind him, Camille standing, not moving, not crumbling, just standing there with her hand on her stomach and her carry-on beside her, watching them go. Beverly watched for a long moment after they disappeared. Then she posted the video with a caption that said only, "This is what abandonment looks like. Somebody find out who she is." She did not know what she had started. Camille stood still for 90 seconds. This was something her grandmother Ernestine had taught her. Count, baby. When everything in you wants to fall, count. Breathe, stay on your feet. You can fall apart later in private where it belongs. Out here you stay on your feet, she counted, she breathed. At 90 seconds, she sat down in the seat beside her carry-on. She set both hands on her stomach. The baby moved once, a slow roll under her palms, a shifting of weight from one side to the other, like someone turning over in sleep. Camille sat with that for a moment. She said very quietly to no one but herself and the child, okay. She picked up her phone. She called Dominique. It rang twice. Dominique said, hey, did you make it? Camille said, he left me at the airport. A beat of silence. Then Dominique said, where are you? Not a question, a location request. Camille said, gate C7. Meridian Terminal. I am fine. I am not crying. My flight boards in 40 minutes. Dominique said, Camille. Camille said, I am going to Miami. I have a board meeting tomorrow and I am going to Miami. I will call you when I land. Dominique was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, I will be at Mama's when you get back. Camille said, okay. She hung up. She did not cancel her flight. She had thought about it for the 40 seconds between hanging up and picking up her boarding pass from her tote bag. She had thought, I could go home. And then she had thought, who's home? The Buckhead house that smelled like his cologne, and the flowers the housekeeper arranged on Mondays, and the specific silence of a marriage that had been in trouble for longer than she had let herself name. That was not home right now. Home was somewhere else. Home was a kitchen in Cascade Heights, where greens were probably already on the stove. She would go home. But not yet. Not in front of this terminal, in front of these 40 people, in front of whoever else Beverly Tolliver's phone had captured. She boarded her flight. She sat in her seat by the window and she looked out at the tarmac, and she breathed through her nose slowly, the way her midwife had shown her, and she did not think about Sterling. She thought about her grandfather, Booker Washington Sr., who had looked up at planes his whole childhood and decided one day that he would own one. She thought about him buying his first small regional aircraft in 1974 with money that 3 different banks had told him he did not have and could not borrow. She thought about how he used to say, every time they passed Hartsfield-Jackson on their way somewhere, Camille, baby, do you know what I built? She had always said yes, Granddaddy. She had not, at 12, at 60, at 20, understood what he meant. Not really. She put her tray table down. She took her board meeting notes out of her carry-on. She read them. By the time her flight landed in Miami, Beverly Tolliver's video had 14,000 views. By the time she checked into the hotel, it had 31,000. She stood under the shower for 20 minutes with the water as hot as she could stand it, and she let herself feel the shape of what had just happened. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to know it was real. He had said her name wrong, and she had known, and she had stood there anyway, because what do you do? What do you do when you are 7 months pregnant at your grandfather's gate and your husband picks up another woman's bag and walks away? You count, you breathe, you stay on your feet. She turned the water off. She dried her hair. She put lotion on her stomach the way she did every night. Slow circles, because her midwife said skin that was being asked to do this much-deserved attention. She said good night to the baby. She said it quietly, out loud, the way she had been saying it since the 2nd month when saying it out loud became something she needed to do. Something that made her feel less alone in all of this becoming. She set her phone on the nightstand. She had 37 missed calls from people who were not Sterling. Sterling had called twice. She did not call him back. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. The hotel air conditioner hummed. Outside, Miami went on being Miami, entirely unaware of what had just happened at Gate C7. She attended the first 2 hours of the Howard Alumni Board meeting the next morning. She made her comments. She was precise and warm, and she did not tell a single person in that room what had happened because that room was not the place, and those people were not the ones. She excused herself at 10:15 and said she had a medical appointment because she was 7 months pregnant, and that was a reasonable thing to say. She got in the car to the airport. She sat in the back seat and looked at her phone. 142,000 views. Sterling had called 4 times. She had not called back. She thought about her grandmother's voice on bad mornings. The way Ernestine would say before anything else, before any advice or any wisdom or any of the words she would eventually offer, I see you, baby. I see you. She was not ready to be seen yet. She needed to get home first. She needed to get inside the walls of somewhere that had known her before she was anyone's wife. She boarded her flight home. She pressed her forehead against the cold of the airplane window, and she watched Atlanta come up beneath the plane, the city spreading out in all directions, the highways and the neighborhoods and the green spaces and the church steeples, and somewhere down there her mother had greens on the stove, and her sister was already on her way over, and her grandmother was probably sitting in the rocker on the front porch with her coffee and her Bible and her specific ancient, unshakable knowledge that everything that was supposed to happen was going to happen. The wheels touched down. Camille picked up her carry-on. She walked through the terminal. She passed gate C7. She did not stop. She did not look. She walked straight through. There was a grandmother somewhere in this airport calling someone's name. There was a child running. There was the smell of the same recycled air and fast food and human exhaustion that had been here yesterday when everything was different. She walked out into the Atlanta afternoon and got into a car and told the driver her parents' address in Cascade Heights and looked out the window and watched the city move past. She cried in the driveway of her parents' house for 11 minutes before she went inside. She had pulled up to the curb and put the car in park and sat there, and the crying came all at once. Not building, just arriving. The way a storm arrives in Atlanta in summer without much warning. She put both hands on the steering wheel, and she let it happen. She did not make much sound. She was not a loud crier. She never had been. The tears came and her chest heaved and she pressed her lips together and cried as quietly and as thoroughly as she could in 11 minutes. Because her mother was watching from the window. She knew that. The porch light was already on and it was 4:30 in the afternoon. And that porch light was her mother's language for "I see you coming, baby. Come on in." She did not want her mother to see it happen in real time. She did not want to walk through that door with her face already fallen. She needed 11 minutes to put something back in place. Not everything, not most things. Just enough. At 11 minutes she stopped. She dried her face with the hem of the caramel wrap dress. She picked up her grandmother's church fan from her purse, the small cardboard one with the Jordan River printed on one side, the one she had carried in every purse since Ernestine pressed it into her hands at 17 and said, "You will want something to hold on to, baby, in the moments when your hands need something to do." She held it. She breathed. She was not ready to pray yet. She would pray later. She would pray when she was inside those walls with her mother's greens on the stove and Dominique's voice in the next room and the particular safety of the house she had grown up in. Right now, she just breathed. Then she picked up her carry-on and her tote bag, and she walked up the front path and the door opened before she touched the knob. The front door opened and Gloria Washington was standing there in her house shoes. Not the good ones, the old ones, the yellow ones with the backs worn flat because she never wanted to stop what she was doing long enough to put them on properly. She was wearing her house dress, the navy blue one, with the tiny white flowers that she had owned for as long as Camille could remember. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her head. She had been in the kitchen. The smell of collard greens and smoked turkey and cornbread came out through the open door and wrapped around Camille like a second pair of arms. Gloria looked at her daughter. She did not say anything immediately. She just looked. The way mothers look when they have already grieved the thing that hasn't been said yet. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider, and Camille walked in. Gloria took her coat. She took the tote bag off her shoulder. She said, "Come on to the kitchen." She did not ask questions. She did not say she had seen the video, though she had. She did not say she had been standing at that window since 3:30 watching for the car. She just led Camille to the kitchen and pulled out the chair that had always been Camille's chair. Since she was small enough to sit in it with her feet dangling, and she put the kettle on and she sat down across the table and waited. The kitchen smelled like every Thursday of Camille's entire life. Greens, cornbread. The lavender candle her mother burned in the living room on Thursday evenings because she said it helped her read. The faint smell of the cedar closet where her mother kept the good dishes. The older smell underneath all of it. The smell that was the house itself, wood and memory, and 34 years of a family living in the same rooms. Camille set both hands flat on the kitchen table. She said, "He left me at the airport." With her. Gloria said, "I know, baby. I saw the video." Camille said the whole city saw the video. Gloria said more than the city, from what Marvella James told me. She called before you even landed in Miami. Camille nodded. She looked at her hands on the table. Nathaniel Booker Washington Jr. came downstairs in his robe at 5:15. Her father was a deliberate man, a slow-moving man, a man who had learned from his own father to let silence do work that words often ruined. He came into the kitchen and he did not say anything. He pulled a chair from the wall and set it next to Camille's, and he sat down and he put his large, careful hand over her hands on the table. He did not speak. He just stayed. This was what Camille had needed most and had not known how to ask for. Not solutions. Not anger on her behalf, though she knew it was there, organized and waiting. Not questions. Just the weight of a hand that had been holding things together for 61 years and knew how to hold. She put her other hand over his. The kettle began to sing. Dominique arrived at midnight. She came through the back door the way she had since they were teenagers. The way that meant she was not coming as company but as family. She was still wearing her salon apron over her clothes. She smelled like the salon, like the sweet particular smell of pressing oil and shea butter and the specific warmth of work that had gone on all day. She was carrying a brown paper bag from the 24-hour diner on the corner of Benjamin E. Mays Drive and Campbellton Road, the one that had been there since before either of them was born and would be there after everyone who remembered its origin was gone. She set the bag on the counter and she looked at Camille. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say it because she loved her sister more completely than she loved being right. But her face said it, in the specific eloquent way that younger sisters' faces say things, and they both knew it, and Camille looked at her sister's face and almost smiled. Dominique sat down next to her. She opened the bag. She put a foam container in front of Camille, chicken and waffles. Camille's order since they were teenagers. She put another in front of their mother. She said, "What do you need right now?" Not a question. A request for instructions. Camille said, "I do not know yet." Dominique said, then we sit here until you do, and they did. At 11:45, Sterling called. His ringtone was a song from the first trip they had taken together, to Savannah, 6 months before they got engaged. She had not changed it because changing it would have meant deciding something she had not been ready to decide. It played now in the quiet kitchen, and everyone looked at the phone on the table and nobody spoke. Camille answered. Sterling said, Camille, I know you are upset. I need you to listen to me, she said. I am listening. His voice had that tone, the measured one, the one she had heard in boardrooms when a deal was going sideways, and he needed to walk someone back from the edge. Calm, controlled, deployed. He said, the way this looks, it is not the full picture. Jade and I have been working on the Chicago expansion logistics for 3 months, and the timing of the flight was about a meeting tomorrow morning, and the optics are bad. I understand that. But if you would let me explain the actual context, she said, Sterling. He kept going. He said, you are 8 months pregnant, and you are,
She said 7 months.
and I am going to hang up now. She hung up. The kitchen was quiet. Gloria said, good. Camille set the phone down. She looked at her mother. She said the thing that had been sitting in the back of her throat since gate C7, the thing she had not let herself say on the plane or in the car or in the driveway in those 11 minutes of private grief. She said, I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw. I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw, she said it quietly. She said it to her mother and her sister and her father in the kitchen and herself. She said it the way you say a thing that has been true for a while and that you have been calling by other names because the true name was too heavy to lift. Gloria said, you are not crazy. You know exactly what you saw. Dominique said, I know what I saw in the video. And so does the 143,000 other people who watched it before midnight. Nathaniel said nothing. He tightened his hand over his daughters and looked at the table and let the women in his family say what needed to be said. By midnight, Deaconess Marvella James had texted 6 members of the Greater Faith African Methodist Episcopal Church prayer chain. She had not framed it as gossip. She had framed it as concern. She had written, our sister Camille needs our prayers tonight. She is going through something, and she needs covering. The distinction between concern and gossip mattered to Marvella James very much. She had made it for 40 years in that congregation. The information traveled the same speed regardless, but the intention mattered to her, and so she was specific about it. By 1 in the morning, the prayer chain had 47 names on it, and somewhere across Atlanta, 47 black women were saying Camille's name to God. At 2 in the morning, Gloria made everyone go to bed. Camille lay in the twin bed in her parents' guest room, the one with the framed copy of her Howard graduation photo on the wall and the blue and white quilt her grandmother had made the winter before Camille's first year at Spelman. The mattress was softer than she remembered. The room smelled like cedar and lavender and her mother's fabric softener. She stared at the ceiling. The baby moved. She put her hand on her stomach. She said, I know, I know. She thought about how long she had known. Not the whole shape of it. Not Jade specifically. But something. Something had been off for 8 months, maybe a year. The way he came home from certain trips differently than he had left. The way his phone had become a thing he held rather than set down. The way he had started saying her name at the beginning of sentences. The careful way you address someone you are being deliberate about. Not the careless way you speak to someone you trust completely. She had explained it to herself. He was under pressure. The Caribbean expansion was the biggest thing Pierce Global had ever attempted. He was working harder than he had ever worked, and that changed a person, changed how available they were, changed what they brought home at the end of the day. She had explained it. She had kept explaining it. She had kept choosing the explanation over the knowing. Lord, I knew. I knew and I stayed anyway. She did not say it out loud. She said it in the particular interior voice that was her truest register, the one that sounded like her grandmother and like herself at once. She stayed in that knowing for a long time. At 6 in the morning, Nathaniel came downstairs. She heard him in the kitchen, the specific sound of her father making coffee, which he had done the same way for 61 years. The measured pour, the particular clink of the good mug against the counter. She heard him pour a second cup. He knocked on the guest room door. She said, "Come in, Daddy." He came in. He set one mug on the nightstand for her. He had his mug in his other hand and a manila folder tucked under his arm. He pulled the small chair from the corner, the one that held whatever jacket had been left in the guest room most recently, and he sat down beside the bed. He set his mug on the floor. He held the manila folder in both hands for a moment. He said, "Baby, there is something you need to know about the airline, about the board meeting next week, about what your grandfather built for you and why it matters right now." Camille looked at the folder. She had known about the trust in the abstract the way you know about something that exists for you in theory, but has never needed to exist for you in practice. Her grandfather had left her something. Her father managed it. There were documents. She had signed things over the years when Nathaniel put things in front of her and explained them. And she had trusted him the way she trusted him in everything, completely and without needing to look over his shoulder. She had never needed to open the folder herself. Her father set it on the bed in front of her. She looked at it. Then she opened it. The top document was a letter, handwritten, in her grandfather's particular careful script, the script of a man who had taught himself to write with precision, because precision was something the world would demand of him in ways it would not demand of others. It was dated 1991, the year before she was born. It was addressed for my Camille Josephine when she needs it most. The second document was the trust agreement, 47 pages. The third document was Meridian Airways' most recent annual report. Camille read for 45 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up at her father. She said, "How much of the company is in my name?" Her father looked at her steadily. He said, "Enough, enough," her father said, and then he told her. Camille sat in the twin bed with the blue and white quilt pulled up over her legs and her grandfather's letter in her hands, and her father's voice filling the guest room with the history of a thing she had owned, without knowing the full weight of what she owned. Booker Washington Sr. had founded Meridian Regional Airways in 1974. He had started with one aircraft, a second-hand turboprop, that the seller had been trying to unload for 2 years because the avionics were outdated and the maintenance costs were climbing, and no one with sense was buying used regional aircraft in the middle of an oil crisis. Booker Washington Sr. had bought it because he had sense, and because sense sometimes looks like foolishness to people who have never had to be creative about survival. He had flown it himself for the first 3 years. He had recruited 2 other pilots from the Atlanta black community, men he had known from his days driving a charter bus route between Atlanta and Savannah. He had hired his wife Ernestine as the person who ran everything that was not the actual flying, which meant she ran everything. He had grown the airline over 25 years from 1 aircraft to 31, from 1 route to 12, from nothing to a mid-size regional carrier with destinations across the American South and the Caribbean, with a maintenance facility in College Park and a training center in East Point and 1,000 employees, most of them black, in an industry that had never in its history made much room for them. When Booker Washington Sr. died in 2003, Meridian Airways was worth more than the 3 banks that had told him in 1974 that he could not borrow the money he needed to start it. The airline was held in a family trust. The controlling interest, 54%, was designated specifically to Camille Josephine Washington Pierce, née Washington, to be activated on her 25th birthday or in the event of a family crisis, whichever came first. Camille had turned 25 7 years ago. She had been a controlling shareholder of Meridian Airways for 7 years. She had never attended a board meeting. She had never exercised a vote. She had never entered the Meridian corporate offices as anything other than Booker Washington's granddaughter, coming to the holiday party with her father, signing the papers Nathaniel put in front of her without reading them the way you sign things that someone you trust has already approved. She had never needed anything from it. And some instinct she had not named and could not explain, had kept her from connecting it to Sterling, from telling him about it in any meaningful way. He knew in the abstract that her grandfather had been in aviation. He knew in the abstract that there was a family trust. He had never asked for details, and she had never offered them, and she had told herself this was because the subject never came up naturally, and because she had never needed to think about it, and because it was her father's domain, not hers. She understood now, sitting in this bed with her grandfather's letter in her hands, that the instinct had not been forgetfulness. It had not been vagueness. It had been knowledge. The body knowledge that runs ahead of language, the kind her grandmother had described as discernment, and her therapist had described as intuition, and that she herself had always experienced as a quiet pressure at the base of her sternum, a small firm hand saying, "Not this, not yet, not him." She had listened to it without knowing she was listening. She put her grandfather's letter in her purse, next to her grandmother's church fan. She said, "I need to see Big Mama." She drove to Ernestine's house in Cascade Heights at 9 in the morning without calling. She parked in front of the house her grandfather had built in 1968 with his own hands and the hands of 7 men from the church, the house that had been in the same place on the same lot for 56 years, while everything around it changed and was replaced and changed again. Big Mama opened the door before she reached the top porch step. Ernestine Washington was 81 years old. She was wearing her house dress, a different one from Gloria's, but made in the same tradition, the tradition of women who had raised their families and buried their husbands and built their legacies in house dresses they did not perform for anyone. Her hair was pinned up the way she pinned it every morning, neat and deliberate, the same way she had done everything for 81 years. She looked at Camille. She said, "I was wondering when you were coming." The biscuits were already made. Camille sat at the kitchen table where she had eaten every Christmas morning of her life. Big Mama poured coffee strong, too sugar, heavy, and set it in front of her. She sat down across from her and she began to talk. Not the myth of Booker Washington Sr. She had told Camille the myth many times, the version that appeared in the Atlanta Tribune profiles and the HBCU Business School case studies. This morning she told her the man. She said the first bank was on Peachtree. A man named Douglas handled the loan applications. He looked at your grandfather's business plan for 11 minutes, and then he looked at your grandfather for 30 seconds, and he said, "We do not typically finance ventures of this nature." Your grandfather said, "What nature is that?" The man could not say, but your grandfather knew. She said the second bank was on Auburn Avenue, a black bank. They wanted to help. They did not have enough. They gave us what they could and they told us to go find the rest. She said the third bank was in Decatur. That loan officer leaned back in his chair and said, "Son, do you know anything about what an airline actually costs to operate?" Your grandfather said, "Yes, sir. I know it to the dollar." He opened his briefcase and he put 47 pages of financial projections on that desk. I had typed them. I had calculated every number. Your grandfather had checked every number, and I had double-checked every number. And then we had done it a third time together at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning for 3 weeks straight. She paused. She drank her coffee. That man read the first page and said he would be in touch. He called 6 weeks later. Camille said, "And that was the one." Big Mama said, "That was the one." She said, "I ran those books for 25 years. My name was not on a single document until 1989 when your grandfather fixed it. But I knew every number and every document. I knew every lease and every flight path and every contract and every name of every person who worked for us. I knew which vendors were reliable and which ones were going to cost us, and which ones we kept because they were ours, because they were part of the community we were building alongside the airline. I made every decision that mattered. I made them alongside your grandfather and most of the time before your grandfather, and always with the understanding that whatever was decided, the credit would go where the world required it to go." She looked at Camille. She said, "When people asked your grandfather how he had done it, he would say, 'I had the right partner.' People heard that, and they thought he meant his business partners, the investors who came in year 3 and year 7. He meant me." She was quiet for a moment. "He meant me." Camille sat with that. She had begun making biscuits while Big Mama talked, because her hands needed to be doing something, and because the kitchen required it of her the way it had always required it of her when she sat in it long enough. She measured nothing. She knew by feel. The way her grandmother had taught her, the weight of the flour in the palm before it goes into the bowl, the temperature of the butter by how it gives, the amount of milk by what the dough tells you it wants. This was the thing her grandmother had taught her that had nothing to do with biscuits and everything to do with confidence. The understanding that there are things the body knows that the mind has to trust. Big Mama said, "That is what he put in your name. Not just a company, not just a percentage of stock in a trust document. A piece of what we built together, out of nothing and against everything. And he wanted you to have it because he something about you before you were born. He looked at your mother's belly when she was carrying you, and he said, 'Ernestine, that one is going to need her own ground.' He said it the way he said things when he knew." Camille set the biscuits in the oven. She sat back down at the table. She said, "Daddy told me about the board meeting." Big Mama said, "I know." She said, "The Pierce Global proposal." Big Mama said, "I know." Camille said, "Sterling does not know." Big Mama said, "No, he does not. This was the thing. This was the size of it." Sterling Devante Pierce had been negotiating with the Meridian Airways board of directors for 6 months. His company's entire Caribbean logistics corridor expansion, the thing that was going to take Pierce Global from a regional freight operation to an international logistics empire, depended on terminal access through Meridian's southern hubs. The proposal was the centerpiece of everything he had been building for the last 3 years. The final approval required the signature of the controlling shareholder. Camille's signature. He had never known. He had walked into meetings in the Meridian boardroom, and he had met with board members, and he had presented his proposal to Dr. Gwendolyn Hayes Jackson and the 5 other people at that table, and he had shaken hands and talked numbers, and never once in 6 months of doing this had anyone told him that the 54% controlling interest in the airline he was trying to partner with was held by his wife. Because no one at that table had known they needed to tell him. Because Camille had never walked through that boardroom door. Because she had been Sterling Pierce's wife in all the rooms where it mattered to be that, and the one room where she was something else she had never entered. She said, "How long have you known about the Pierce Global proposal?" Big Mama said, Since the first meeting. Camille looked at her grandmother. She said, "Why did you not say anything?" Big Mama looked at her over the rim of her coffee mug. She said, "Because you did not need to know yet. I was praying you would never need to know this way. I was praying for a different kind of day." She set the mug down. "But here we are, sugar." She said it the particular way she said sugar to Camille, which was the way that meant, "I know how much this is costing you, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, and I am also not going to let you forget how much you can carry." Camille thought about her grandfather's letter. She had read it 3 times before she folded it back along its original crease. She knew it now. She could hear it in her grandfather's voice, his careful, deliberate voice, the voice that had always sounded like a man who had weighed every word before he offered it. He had written, "Camille, if you are reading this when I thought you would, you are in a moment that is difficult and you are trying to decide if you are strong enough. You are. Your grandmother showed me what it looks like when a woman is truly strong. It looks like patience. It looks like preparation. It looks like not needing to show your cards until the right hand. You were born to this. Trust the moment that brings you to this letter." She took the letter out of her purse. She held it in both hands. She did not read it again. She just held it. Big Mama reached across the table and put her hand over Camille's. She said, "The oven timer is going to go off in 4 minutes." Camille said, "I know." They sat there together in the kitchen that smelled like biscuits in November and 56 years of a family's accumulated love. 2 women across his table, one of them 81 and one of them 32, and the timer went off, and Camille got up and took the biscuits out of the oven. She had one choice. She understood that now. Not the choice of whether to fight, not the choice of whether to survive this. Those were not choices. Those were requirements. She was going to fight, and she was going to survive this because she was Ernestine Washington's granddaughter, and Nathaniel Washington's daughter, and the woman Booker Washington Sr. had written a letter to before she was born. And those women and that man did not raise someone who collapsed in the face of the thing they had been preparing her for without knowing they were preparing her. The choice was whether to step into the room, whether to pick up the inheritance that had been waiting for her, not the money, not the percentage, but the position. Whether to stop being someone's wife in the rooms where she had every right to be herself. She had spent 6 years choosing other people's moments over her own. She was going to choose hers. Now, she said, "I need to call someone." Big Mama said, "Renata Holloway." Camille looked at her. Big Mama said she went to Howard Law. She is the best divorce attorney in Atlanta. I got her number from Marvella James 3 months ago. She paused, just in case. Camille stared at her grandmother. She said, 3 months ago. Big Mama said, "I told you, the body knows." The elevator in Renata Holloway's building was glass. On the way up, Camille could see the Atlanta skyline spreading out behind her, the city in all its complicated, contradictory, magnificent self. The skylines that told the story of what had been built here and by whom and at what cost. She could see the dome of the Capitol. She could see the cluster of towers in Midtown, where Sterling's office occupied the 28th floor of a building he had leased 3 years ago, because the view from the east-facing windows showed the airport. He had shown her that view on the day they signed the lease. He had said, "You can see where everything comes from and where everything goes." She had thought that was beautiful. She thought about it now and understood it differently. On the way up in the glass elevator, she thought, "I built some of this. I just never claimed it." She thought about every event she had attended as Sterling Pierce's wife, every Chamber of Commerce dinner, and every NAACP gala, and every Howard University fundraiser, and every real estate developer's anniversary party, and every charity auction in Buckhead. She had been in those rooms. She had worked those rooms with a particular kind of skill that people who watch power closely would recognize, and people who hold power carelessly would never notice. She had introduced Sterling to men who became his investors. She had smoothed situations that would have cost him relationships. She had made him look like the kind of man a serious person married, which is something you cannot buy and cannot fake and cannot manufacture. You can only borrow it from someone who built it themselves. She had lent it to him freely because she loved him and because she had believed his success was their success and because she was raised in a family that understood that what is built together belongs together. She was beginning to understand that she had been the only one in their marriage who believed that. Renata Holloway's office was on the 22nd floor. It smelled like fresh coffee and clean carpet, and the particular seriousness of a room where consequential things were regularly decided. There was a framed quote on the wall, a quote from Pauli Murray, a black woman who had been a lawyer and a poet and an ordained Episcopal priest and an architect of civil rights law, a woman who had done more for the legal structure of American equality than most people whose names appeared in textbooks. Renata had told her once at a Howard alumni event 3 years ago that she kept Pauli Murray on her wall because she considered it a problem that most people had never heard of her, and she was personally solving that problem one client at a time. Camille had liked her then. She liked her more now. Renata Holloway was 41 years old. She was from Baltimore, Maryland, born to a family with deep roots in the NAACP, Howard Law, partner at Holloway & Associates. She had been divorced for 5 years from a man who had, according to the knowing that circulated through the Howard alumni network, severely underestimated her. The divorce had taken 14 months. She had won every significant point. She had written about the experience in a Yale Law Review article on equitable distribution doctrine, citing her own case in the footnotes in a way that was technically permitted and widely considered magnificent. She closed the door of the conference room. She opened a legal pad. She said, "Tell me what happened. Start at the airport." Camille told her. She told it the way she had already organized it in her mind, in the order it happened, without editorializing and without minimizing. She told her about Gate C7 and the caramel wrap dress and the 90 seconds of counting. She told her about the flight to Miami and the board meeting and the 142,000 views and the 37 missed calls. She told her about her father's manila folder and her grandfather's letter and the biscuits in Ernestine's kitchen. She told her about 54%. Renata listened without interrupting. She wrote on her legal pad in the tight, efficient handwriting of a woman who had learned to capture information fast and accurately. When Camille finished, Renata set down her pen. She said, "Let me tell you what you have." She said, "Georgia is an equitable distribution state. That means marital assets are divided by what is fair, not automatically split 50-50. The court looks at contribution, duration of the marriage, the economic circumstances of each party. Equitable does not mean equal. It means fair." She said, "The Meridian Airways trust was established before your marriage, and its value almost certainly qualifies as separate property. The trust predates the marriage by 7 years and was established not by you, but by your grandfather as part of his estate plan. His intent is documented in the trust instrument. His letter reinforces it. A competent attorney, and I am telling you plainly that I am a competent attorney, will argue successfully that Meridian is yours and yours alone." She said, "Pierce Global Logistics is more complicated. It was built during the marriage. Your husband will argue that he built it. He is not entirely wrong. But he is not entirely right either," she said. "Your contributions to Pierce Global's success have never appeared on a payroll. You have never drawn a salary. You have never held a title. But contribution to a marital estate does not require a paycheck. Georgia courts have been increasingly clear about this. Your social capital, your community relationships, your HBCU network, the clients who came through your introductions, the credibility you provided in rooms where credibility was the difference between a deal and a missed opportunity, those have economic value. A forensic economist can document and quantify that value. I have one I work with regularly. She is excellent." Camille said. "He insisted on a prenuptial agreement." Renata said, "I assumed." "Can you describe its terms?" Camille said, "It protects Pierce Global as his separate property. It specifies that the company's assets are not subject to equitable distribution in the event of divorce." He presented it as standard. His attorney presented it as standard. I reviewed it and I signed it. Renata said, "Did you have independent counsel review it before you signed?" Camille said, "No." Renata said, "That is relevant but not determinative. Tell me this, does the agreement contain a fidelity clause?" Camille was quiet for a moment. She thought back to the prenuptial agreement, the document she had read once and signed at 26 and had not thought about since. She said, "I believe so. I remember something about the agreement being voidable under certain conditions." Renata said, "I will need to see the document. But if it contains a standard fidelity clause, and many agreements drafted in the past 15 years do then documented infidelity voids the protective provisions. It does not make the agreement disappear. It means the specific protections he relied on to keep Pierce Global insulated are no longer operative. Being strong does not mean I deserve this." The thought arrived quietly. Camille felt it land and held it there. She said it to herself the way she was beginning to understand she needed to say things, declaratively, without the question mark she had been attaching to her own certainties for years. Being strong does not mean I deserve this. She had been strong every day of this marriage. She had been composed and gracious and endlessly available, and she had put his needs in front of her own so consistently and so completely that she had lost the habit of distinguishing between the two. She had done all of this out of love, real love, love she had chosen freely and maintained with intention, and none of it meant she deserved to be left at an airport. Strength was not a contract. Love was not insurance. She had not earned betrayal by being strong enough to survive it. Renata said, The prenuptial agreement he used to protect himself may be the same document that strips those protections away. He wrote a fidelity clause and then violated it publicly. In front of 142,000 people, in front of his wife's airline. She said the last sentence carefully and watched Camille's face when she said it. Camille said, "He does not know it is my airline." Renata said no. There was a specific quality of silence that followed that. Not an empty silence, a full one. Renata said, "What do you want to do?" Camille looked at her hands on the conference table. She thought about her grandfather's letter. She thought about Ernestine's face across the kitchen table at 9 in the morning with the biscuits coming out of the oven. She thought about what she had said standing at gate C7 to herself and to her daughter. "Okay," she said, "I want to do this right. I want to do this so that my child grows up proud of how her mother handled this. And I want to do this so that I never have to do it again." Renata said, "Those are the right reasons." She picked up her pen. She said, "I am going to need the prenuptial agreement, any documentation you have of the infidelity, financial records you have access to, and the Meridian Trust documentation. Can you get all of that to me by Friday?" Camille said, "Yes." Renata said, "Then we will meet again Monday." She stood. She extended her hand. Camille shook it. Renata said, "Camille, I need you to understand something before you leave this office." Camille said, "All right." Renata said, "You walked in here as a woman in crisis. That is what you feel like from the inside. What I see from the outside is a woman with assets, rights, legal standing, and options that her husband has never counted and cannot now use against her. Those two things are both true at the same time. The crisis is real, and so is the position." Camille looked at her for a moment. She said, "Thank you." She walked out of the conference room and into the reception area and stopped. Lavinia Pierce was sitting in one of the gray chairs by the window. She was wearing a bone-colored blazer and a strand of pearls, and the expression of a woman who had been rehearsing something difficult for a very long time and had finally decided to say it. She stood up when she saw Camille. She said, "I came to give you what I should have given you a year ago." Lavinia Pierce had been rehearsing this moment for 11 months. She had rehearsed it in the kitchen of her Druid Hills home on mornings when the house was quiet and the coffee was still too hot to drink. She had rehearsed it in the car on the drive to church and on the drive back when the pastor's words had landed too close to things she was not ready to name. She had rehearsed it on the phone with her sister in Charlotte, who had been saying for 2 years that Lavinia needed to do something, and Lavinia had been saying that it was complicated, and her sister had been saying that it always is, and that had not helped either of them very much. She had not expected to say it in an attorney's waiting room, but she had long since stopped expecting the important things to happen the way she planned them. She was 64 years old. She was wearing the bone-colored blazer she wore when she needed to feel like herself, when she needed the external evidence of her own composure because the internal evidence was insufficient. She had her good bag. Her pearls were the ones her mother had given her at her college graduation, real ones, the only piece of significant jewelry she had kept through every hard season of her life. She looked at Camille. She did not say she was sorry immediately. She said what she had come to say. She said, 11 months ago, Reginald Baines called me. He said it was a courtesy call. He said that Sterling was involved with someone at the company and that he thought I should know. He said it carefully, the way men say things carefully when they want the information delivered but do not want to be the ones who delivered it. She said, I confronted Sterling. He told me I was misunderstanding the situation. He told me Jade was a colleague and that the relationship was professional and that Reginald had always been someone who read things wrong. He was calm. He was very calm. He looked me in the eye. She paused. She said he looked exactly like his father. Camille said nothing. She waited. Lavinia said, I watched my husband become a stranger to this family over the course of 10 years. I watched him choose things and people that were not us, and I stayed quiet because I did not know what speaking would cost me. Because my own mother had stayed quiet in her marriage and her mother before that, and I had learned that silence was what women like us did in these situations. That silence was dignity. She stopped. She looked at her hands. I am not sure I was right. I am not sure my mother was right. I am sure that I watched my son grow up in that silence, and I watched him learn from it. The wrong things. She opened her good bag. She took out a white envelope and held it in both hands for a moment. She said, I have hotel receipts. 2 trips in the past 7 months, charged to a corporate card I was not supposed to know existed. I have the account number for a secondary account that I found 2 months ago when I was helping Sterling organize some paperwork after his assistant went on leave. She said, and I have a letter. She held out the envelope. Camille took it. Lavinia said, Jade wrote it by hand. She is the kind of woman who puts things in writing, which is either her strength or her undoing. I have not decided. She left it at the office, Sterling's office. I went to the office 2 months ago to drop off papers for his assistant, and I looked where I should not have. Because I'm my mother's daughter, and my mother always looked. Camille held the envelope in both hands. Lavinia said, I am not your enemy. I should have come to you when Reginald called me. I did not. I told myself I was protecting my son. I was protecting my own comfort. She said it plainly, without sentimentality, the way a woman says a hard, true thing about herself when she has decided that the alternative is worse. She looked at Camille steadily. She said, my late mother-in-law used to say the Washingtons were old money with manners. I think she was right. Camille looked at Lavinia Pierce for a long moment. She thought about 6 years of Sunday dinners and holidays, and the woman across from her saying the right thing at the right time in the right company, and smiling the correct smile at the correct moment. She thought about Lavinia Pierce at the wedding, standing at the front of Greater Faith A.M.E., in a mauve dress and pearls, her eyes bright in a way that Camille had read as joy and was now reading as something more complicated, something like prayer. She thought about how many people in her life had known something she did not know and had chosen their silence. She did not say this out loud. It was not the moment for it, and Lavinia was not the person to say it to, not yet. She said, I'm glad you came. She said it because it was true. Lavinia nodded. She picked up her bag. She said, call me if there is anything else I can give you. I mean that. She walked out. Camille went back into the conference room and gave the envelope to Renata. She left Renata's office at 4:30 in the afternoon and took the elevator down to the parking garage. She found her car on the 3rd level, and she sat in it without starting the engine. She looked at the concrete column directly in front of her windshield. It was gray and marked with the paint transfers of 10,000 parking encounters, every one of them a small minor collision in someone's ordinary day. She sat with that. The baby kicked. 3 times, spaced evenly, the way the baby kicked when she was sitting too still for too long. As if to say, I am here, I am here, I am here, in case you needed reminding. She said, I know. I know. She thought about the text she had typed and deleted over the past 2 days. The text to Dominique that said, I am falling apart, and that she had deleted and replaced with, I am okay, everything is okay. The text to her mother that said, I do not know who I married, and that she had deleted because she was not ready for her mother to see that in writing. The text to Sterling that said, you owe me the truth about everything, and that she had deleted because she knew if she sent it, she would spend 3 days waiting for his version of the truth, which would not be the truth. She had spent 6 years editing herself for Sterling's comfort, 6 years choosing the version of the sentence that would not alarm him, would not challenge him, would not make him feel accused. She had done it so consistently and so automatically that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. It had felt like consideration. It had felt like emotional intelligence. It had felt like the kind of careful love that good marriages were built on. She was sitting in a parking garage on the 22nd floor of an Atlanta office building with her divorce attorney's business card in her purse and her husband's mother's evidence in a white envelope, and she was understanding that what she had called consideration had also been self-erasure. That what she had called emotional intelligence had also been fear. Fear that if she said the true sentence instead of the edited one, he would look at her differently. That she would become, in his eyes, a difficult woman. And a difficult woman was not what Sterling Pierce had married. She thought, I have been code switching for his comfort for 6 years. She started the car. She drove to Dominique's salon, which was closed at 4:30, but where Dominique was still at the books, the way she was every Thursday, because Thursday was the day she reconciled the week's accounts and paid the vendors. Camille knew her sister's rhythms the way she knew her own pulse. She did not call ahead. She let herself in with the spare key that had lived on her keychain for 4 years. Dominique was at the desk in the back, calculator in one hand, pencil behind her ear. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. She put down the calculator. She did not ask any questions. She pulled the rolling chair out from the styling station in the back, the chair that Camille had sat in since she was 8 years old, since the first time Dominique, 10 years old herself and already serious about hair, had practiced box braids on her older sister with their grandmother supervising from the doorway. She pulled it out and she said, sit. Camille sat. Dominique went to the back and made tea the way their grandmother had taught them. Strong enough to mean something. Honey instead of sugar, a squeeze of lemon because their grandmother said the lemon was what made it honest. She brought it out and handed a mug to Camille and sat in the other rolling chair with her own mug, and she said nothing for a long time. She just let the salon be what it had always been, the place where things could be put down. The salon smelled like shea butter and pressing oil, and the particular warmth of a space that had been tended carefully for 4 years by a woman who loved what she did. The product shelves were organized by type and alphabetically within type, because Dominique organized things by her own system, and had no interest in other people's systems. There were photos on the wall, clients whose hair Dominique had braided and twisted and pressed and colored, a gallery of the specific and intimate trust between a black woman and the person who touches her crown. Camille looked at the photos. She had been on that wall once from a few years ago, before she had started going to the salon Sterling preferred, the one in Buckhead that charged $400 for a press and curl and called it a smoothing treatment. She thought, I have been in the wrong salon. She thought, I have been in the wrong a lot of places. She said out loud the thing she had been carrying since she opened the folder in her parents' guest room. He was trying to buy my grandfather's airline. Dominique looked at her over the rim of her mug. She said, Pierce Aviation Holdings. He incorporated it in Delaware 14 months ago. Registered agent is Reg Baines. He has been positioning to acquire Meridian. He did not know I already own it. Dominique was quiet for a long time. Then she said he tried to buy your grandfather's airline. Camille said he did not know it was my grandfather's. He was negotiating a partnership, terminal access and logistics rights. But there was a second company, a shadow company, set up to eventually acquire controlling interest in Meridian once the partnership established his presence in the network. She said it flatly, the way facts sound when you have been sitting with them long enough that the shock is flattened into information. Dominique said, Camille. Camille said, I know. Dominique said, he was standing on your grandfather's floor when he left you. Camille said, he was standing at my grandfather's gate. The salon was quiet. Outside, Atlanta went on, somebody's music from the laundromat across the street, a car horn, the neighborhood going on without knowing. Dominique said, what are you going to do? Camille said, I am going to the board meeting. His money was never mine, and I built more than he knows. She heard it in her own voice, inside the declarative voice that was becoming something new, something with less question in it, something that had stopped waiting for permission. His money was never mine. She had never needed it, and she had never been fooled into thinking it was hers. Not really. She had her own. She had always had her own. She had simply never exercised it. And she had built more than he knew. The community relationships in the HBCU network, and the introductions to the investors who became his investors, and the grace in the rooms where grace was the difference between a deal and a relationship was the difference between an empire and a company. She had built all of it. It had been invisible to him because he had never needed to look. He was going to have to look now. The organ had just finished the processional when Camille walked in. Every head turned, not all at once, not rudely. The way heads turn in a congregation that knows someone, that has watched someone grow up in these pews, that has been praying for that someone by name since Thursday midnight. A slow, inevitable turning, like flowers toward light, like people who have been waiting. Greater Faith African Methodist Episcopal Church had been on the corner of Cascade Road and Benjamin E. Mays Drive for 57 years. It had been Booker and Ernestine Washington's church before it was Nathaniel and Gloria's church. It had been Camille's church since she was carried into it at 3 weeks old. The building had been expanded twice, and the organ had been replaced once, and the carpet had been changed 3 times. But the particular quality of light through the stained glass on the east side of the sanctuary, the golden amber light of a Sunday morning in October, had been the same for 57 years. It fell through the same windows. It landed on the same pews. Camille did not hide. This was the first thing the congregation understood about her this Sunday. She did not hide. She wore navy blue, the good shoulder dress that Dominique had brought to their parents' house on Saturday morning because she knew, without being asked, what Camille would need to wear. Her hair was pressed. She had done it herself on Friday night, standing at the mirror in her parents' guest bathroom with the flat iron her grandmother had bought her 12 Christmases ago, the one with the ceramic plates and the ceramic smell, and the specific heat that her grandmother had always called honest heat, heat you can trust because it does not pretend to be something it is not. She had pressed it section by section, slowly, the ritual of it a kind of prayer, the smell of the pressing oil, the give of the hair under the heat, the transformation, section by section, from something unruly into something smooth and deliberate and hers. She had pressed her hair on Friday nights her entire adult life, even when she could have paid someone else to do it, because her grandmother had taught her and she had never wanted to stop. Sterling had once said, "Why do you not just go to the salon every week? It would be easier." She had said, "I like doing it myself." He had not understood that. He had not understood that the doing was the point, that the ritual of it was not about the result, that some things you do with your own hands because your grandmother's hands are in yours when you do them, and that is not something you outsource. She walked in with Gloria on her left and Dominique on her right. Sterling was not there. Deaconess Marvella James crossed the aisle before Camille reached the second pew. Marvella James was 72 years old. She had been at Greater Faith for 40 years. She had been on the deaconess board for 23. She had known Ernestine Washington before Camille's parents were married. She had held Camille at her baby dedication and watched her at her baptism at 12 and stood at the back of the sanctuary at her wedding 6 years ago and cried the way women cry when they know what they're watching and are not sure how much of it is joy. She was a small woman. She had always been a small woman, even at 72. But she crossed the aisle with the authority of someone who has spent 40 years being the presence that a congregation turns to when it needs to know where to stand. She took both of Camille's hands in hers. She looked at her. She said, "We see you, baby, we see you," and that was the thing. Not the sympathy, not the support, not the prayer chain or the casseroles that had been showing up at Gloria's house since Friday morning. The being seen. The specific, accurate, unmistakable recognition of a woman who knew the difference between watching and witnessing. Camille's composure broke for exactly 30 seconds. She squeezed Marvella's hand. She breathed. She got herself back. She sat down in the second pew, between her mother and her grandmother, and she straightened her spine, and she was present. Pastor Jerome Caldwell did not preach about betrayal. He had too much craft and too much integrity for that. He preached about integrity. He preached the difference between a man's reputation and a man's character. He preached about the specific courage required to be who you are in private when no one is watching, and how that private self is the only self that matters when the public one is stripped away. He said, "A man can be dressed in his best on Sunday morning and be a stranger to himself by Tuesday afternoon, and the Sunday clothes will not save him. The Sunday voice will not save him. The only thing that saves a man, that saves any of us, is the private work we do when the audience is gone." He said, "We are not talking about anyone in particular. Nobody in that congregation believed him. Everybody in that congregation understood exactly what he meant. They understood it the way people who have been in community together for decades understand things, in the specific frequency of shared knowledge. Sterling Pierce was not in that congregation." After the service, Nathaniel walked beside Camille to the car. He said quietly, so only she could hear, "The Meridian board has been getting calls from members this week about the Pierce Global Partnership. In light of the video, Dr. Hayes Jackson has been fielding them. She told me this morning that the board wants to hear from you before the meeting on Thursday." Camille said, "Then they will." She said it the way she had been beginning to say things, without the question mark. That afternoon, Renata sent a document. The document was a Delaware incorporation filing. The company name was Pierce Aviation Holdings, Limited Liability Company. Registered 14 months ago. Registered agent, Reginald Deshawn Baines. The stated business purpose was acquisition and management of assets in the aviation sector. Sterling had not been trying to partner with Meridian Airways. He had been trying to own it. He had used the partnership proposal as the first step. Establish presence in the network. Build relationships with the board members. Get the access agreements in place. And then, once the access was established and the relationship was cemented, and the board was familiar and comfortable with Pierce Global's presence in their operations, begin acquiring shares. Work toward a controlling position, not immediately, over time. The patient acquisition that looks like nothing until suddenly it is everything. He had been planning to buy her grandfather's airline. He had walked into every one of those boardroom meetings and he had charmed Dr. Gwendolyn Hayes Jackson and he had presented his projections, and he had shaken hands and he had never known, through 6 months of doing this, that the woman whose grandfather had built the thing he was trying to take was the woman who pressed his shirts on Sunday nights and made sure his calendar was clear before the big meetings, and had sat across from him at their kitchen table every morning for 6 years. He had not known because he had not looked. "I kept his secrets and he sold mine." She said it in the interior voice that was becoming her truest register. I kept his secrets. She had kept them all. The deals that had not gone the way he claimed in the community. The investors he had disagreed with and frozen out. The employees he had treated in ways she had quietly, carefully repaired by paying attention and following up. She had kept every secret of his professional life that she had stumbled onto, not because he asked her to, but because she had understood from the beginning that protecting him was part of loving him, and he had sold hers. He had taken the grace and credibility she had built over 32 years of being Gloria and Nathaniel Washington's daughter and Booker and Ernestine Washington's granddaughter, and he had put it in his pocket and used it to open doors that would not have opened for him otherwise, and he had never once said, "This is yours. I borrowed this from you. I should say so." She was done keeping secrets for a man who did not even know the ones she was keeping. She called Renata. Renata said, "I know. I sent you the filing." Camille said, "What does it mean for the partnership proposal?" Renata said, "It means the partnership proposal was always step one of a longer play. We will need to present this to the Meridian board before the meeting. They need to know what they were actually being walked into." Camille said, "I will be at the board meeting." Renata said, "Good, I will be there with you." She hung up. She called Dr. Gwendolyn Hayes Jackson directly. Dr. Hayes Jackson answered on the second ring. She said, "Camille Washington Pierce, I was expecting your call." Camille said, "I will be at the Thursday meeting, Dr. Hayes Jackson, as controlling shareholder." Dr. Hayes Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is long past time." Sterling's voice on the phone on Tuesday morning sounded like a man who believed the situation was still manageable. She recognized that voice. She had heard it in every business call she had ever been adjacent to, in every deal where the terms had shifted and he needed to walk the other side back from the edge without letting them know how much they'd shifted. It was his most practiced voice, the smooth, unhurried voice that sounded like confidence and was actually control. He said, "Camille, I think we need to sit down, as adults, and have a real conversation about where we are and where we are going. Whatever you are feeling right now is valid. I am not dismissing that. I want to address it." She said, "All right, Thursday at noon, the restaurant." He said, "Of course." She arrived first. She arrived 12 minutes before noon, and she was seated at the table that had always been theirs, the table in the corner by the window that looked out onto Peachtree Road, and she was composed when he walked in. She could feel it, the way you can feel the difference between performing composure and actually having it. For 6 years she had performed it in his presence, the careful assembled calm of a woman managing how she was perceived. What she felt now was different, still uncertain in a way that did not require maintenance. He was wearing the charcoal blazer again, the same one. She noticed that and filed it without feeling anything about it. He sat down across from her. He looked at her the way men look at their wives when they are trying to read how much they know and how much they are prepared to do with what they know. He said, "You look well." She said nothing. He called the server over without consulting her. He said, "The usual, please, for both of us." The server nodded and left. Camille noted this. 6 years of this particular invisibility, performed not with malice but with the casual certainty of a man who had never needed to ask because he had always assumed he knew. The assumption itself was the problem. The assumption that what he knew about her was the same as what she knew about herself. He said, "The Meridian board meeting is Thursday. The partnership agreement is the critical step in the Caribbean corridor expansion. I need that agreement on the table, and I need it moving." The timeline, as Camille said, "I know about Pierce Aviation Holdings." The bourbon glass stopped halfway to his mouth. She watched it stop. She watched the recalibration happen in real time, the almost invisible pause, before the pivot that she had watched him perform in business meetings for 6 years and was only now naming for what it was. He set the glass down. He said, "I was going to tell you about that." She said, "When?" He said, "When the time was right." She said, "Sterling, you left me at the airport on Thursday. You have had a relationship with someone who works for you for at least 18 months. You incorporated a company to acquire an asset and did not disclose it to your wife. And you asked me to meet you for lunch to talk about a board meeting. Do you want to continue explaining, or do you want to tell me what you actually came here to say?" He looked at her. She looked back. For a real moment, not a performed one, not the managed version he showed in negotiations, he looked like the man she had married. The 26-year-old at the HBCU consortium event who had said, "I want to build something that outlasts me," and she had believed him completely. Because he had said it the way people say things that are true. He said, "I do not know who I became." She said, "I do." She said it quietly, and she meant it as information, not as cruelty. She had watched it happen, move by careful move, over 6 years. She had watched him become the man who said "we" when he meant "I," who deployed charm like currency, who had used the ground of their marriage to build a platform and had never once asked whether the ground minded. She said, "I thought loving him was enough to protect us. I was wrong." She said it to herself inside in the declarative voice. Not to him. He was not the audience for this truth. She was. She said out loud to him, "I am leaving." She stood up. She put money on the table for the drinks because her mother had raised her to leave a proper tip regardless of how she felt about the people she was leaving it on behalf of, and that raising did not stop applying just because her marriage was ending. She walked out of the restaurant and into the Atlanta afternoon. She got in her car and she sat there for 4 minutes with the engine off. She looked at the restaurant door. She did not know what she expected to see. He did not come out. She drove to Dominique's salon. It was closed on Tuesdays, but Dominique was there restocking product, and Camille let herself in with the key and sat down in the back chair and did not speak for a long time. Dominique brought her a bottle of water and sat across from her and did not ask anything. And this was the most generous thing anyone could have done in that moment. The salon was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator where the conditioning treatments were kept. The faint sound of traffic outside, the particular smell of the place that was Dominique's. "That was home," Camille said. "He looked like the man I married for about 30 seconds. Dominique said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said he does not know who he became." Dominique said, "What did you say?" She said, "I told him I did." Dominique was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." That evening, Renata called. She said, "Sterling's attorneys have sent a letter to the Meridian Board challenging the legal standing of the Washington Family Trust. They are arguing procedural deficiencies in the trust's original establishment." Camille said, "Is the trust airtight?" Renata said, "The trust is airtight. Your grandfather's estate attorneys were meticulous. This challenge has no merit. It will be rejected." She paused. She said, "But this tells me his attorneys are very close to understanding the full picture of what they are dealing with. They are getting closer. We need to move faster." Camille said Thursday. Renata said Thursday. She did not sleep. She prayed instead. Not the organized kind, not the Sunday kind, not the prayer she put in her journal in the morning, in the neat specific sentences she had been writing since she was 19. The other kind. The kind that sounds like an argument and feels like wrestling and ends, eventually, like breathing. She lay in the twin bed in her parents' guest room with the blue and white quilt over her and the darkness pressed around her, and she said to God things she had never said to anyone out loud. She said them plainly, without the softening she applied to most of the things she said. She said, "I stayed. I loved him well. I held the whole thing together in ways he never saw, and I never asked him to see, and I am asking you now to tell me what that was for, because I cannot figure it out on my own." The darkness did not answer. It sat with her. She was learning what answered her prayers most often. Not solutions, not explanations. Presence. She asked the ceiling, "What did I do wrong?" And then she caught herself. She lay there and felt the question sitting in her chest and recognized it for what it was. Not an honest question. A reflex. The particular reflex of a woman who has been the responsible one for so long that when something goes wrong, her first move is to look inward for the failure that caused it. The reflex that says it must be something you did or did not do, something you should have seen or said or been differently. She held the reflex up and looked at it, and she put it down. Not what did I do wrong? What did I let myself believe? The distinction was not small. The first question was about fault. The second question was about truth. And the truth was that she had let herself believe things she had not fully believed, things her body had been flagging for a year with the particular language the body uses when the mind is not ready to listen. She had let herself believe his explanations. She had let herself believe that the distance she felt was the distance of a man under pressure, not the distance of a man who was somewhere else. She had let herself believe that her instincts were anxiety, that her knowing was fear, that the quiet pressure at the base of her sternum that said, "Not this, not yet, not him," was just the ordinary nervousness of a woman waiting for the other shoe. The other shoe had dropped at gate C7. She had not been wrong to love him. Love was not the mistake. Love was never the mistake. What she had done wrong, if wrong was even the right word, if anything so human and so understandable could be held to that standard, was to love him in a way that required her to make herself less so that he could feel like more. To hold her truest self at a quiet distance because the fullness of her had always seemed, in some rooms they shared, to be more than he was comfortable standing next to. She had never been asked to do this. He had never said, "Be smaller." He had simply been a man who filled whatever room he was in, and she had accommodated that filling by pulling her own edges back, and she had done it long enough and consistently enough that she had lost the habit of taking up her full space. She thought about her grandfather's letter. She recited it in the dark, the way she had recited scripture as a child, the whole shape of it committed to memory in the first reading and held there because some things you need to be able to access in the dark. You were born to this. Trust the moment that brings you to this letter. At 3:14 in the morning, she picked up her phone. She called Ernestine. It rang twice. Big Mama answered. She said I was awake. Camille said nothing. Big Mama breathed. Camille breathed. This went on for 11 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Camille lay in the dark and held the phone and breathed, and her grandmother breathed back, and that was the whole of it, the entirety of what was needed. Two women breathing together across the dark because words were not the right instrument for this hour. Finally, Big Mama said, "You know what your grandfather told me the night before he had to sign the bank agreement that would have given that bank too much of Meridian?" He said, "Ernestine, I am afraid." I said, I know. He said, what do I do with afraid? I said, you get up in the morning and you do the next right thing. Just the next right thing. That is all. Camille said, what is the next right thing for me? Big Mama said, you know what it is, sugar. You have always known. She hung up. She lay in the dark for another hour. The house was quiet around her. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere a dog was barking, and somewhere a car was moving, and the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood at 3 in the morning went on entirely indifferent to the fact that she was lying in this bed sorting through the wreckage of 6 years. At 4 in the morning, she got up. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the stove for a moment in her pajamas and her socks, looking at the pots and pans hanging from the rack her parents had installed in 1998 when her father decided the kitchen needed more function and less counterclutter. She pulled down the large pot, the one that had been in this kitchen since before she was born, and she began to make her grandmother's vegetable soup. She measured nothing. She opened the refrigerator, and she found what was there and she used it. Carrots and celery and the end of a white onion, and the last of the sweet potatoes her mother had bought last week. She found dried thyme in the spice cabinet in the same spot it had always been, third shelf, right side, because her mother had never moved her spices and never planned to. She found chicken stock in the back of the pantry. She worked slowly and quietly, the knife on the cutting board in the specific rhythm of someone who was not in a hurry, who was not cooking toward a goal. She was cooking the way her grandmother had taught her, by feel, by knowledge that lived in the hands. She was not hungry. She needed her grandmother's hands. She needed the specific intelligence of muscle memory, the way doing something your grandmother taught you puts her in the room with you, puts her hands over yours, puts her voice in your ear saying, a little more of the time, baby, it can take it. She ate 2 bowls standing at the stove in the dark, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard where the fig tree her grandfather had planted in 1979 had shed its leaves and stood bare and patient in the October cold. She washed the pot. She stood at the kitchen table and she pulled a notepad from the drawer where her mother kept the notepads, the same drawer it had always been in, and she sat down and wrote. She wrote 3 questions. Question 1. Question 2. Question 3. She read them back. She was going to the board meeting on Thursday. Not as Sterling's wife. Not as Booker Washington's granddaughter, though she was that too and would always be that. She was going as the woman on the trust document. As the woman who had been a controlling shareholder of Meridian Airways for 7 years and had never walked through the boardroom door. She was walking through the door on Thursday. She folded the notepad. She put it in her purse next to her grandfather's letter and her grandmother's church fan. She went back to bed at 5 in the morning. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was different, and by 6 she knew exactly what she was doing and why and how, and that knowledge was the closest thing she had had to peace since Gate C7. She thought about what her grandmother would say. Big Mama would say, you know what it is, sugar. She did know. Her heels on the marble floor of the Meridian Airways corporate offices. Loud, deliberate, hers. The Meridian Airways corporate offices occupied the 14th floor of a building in Buckhead that Booker Washington Sr. had chosen in 1991 because he could see the airport from the east-facing windows. He had stood in this space before the lease was signed, and he had looked out at Hartsfield-Jackson, the runways and the terminals and the planes coming and going in their slow, enormous choreography, and he had said to Ernestine, every time I look at this, I want to see where I came from and what I built. She had said, then sign the lease. Camille had been in this building twice. Her grandfather's memorial luncheon in 2003, when she was 9, when she had sat in the conference room and eaten a little sandwich and cried quietly and tried to understand what it meant that someone who had seemed as permanent as the earth could simply be gone. And her grandmother's 75th birthday, which the Meridian Board had insisted on hosting in this building because Ernestine Washington had run the books for 25 years, and the people who knew what that meant needed to say so formally, with food and speeches, and the particular ceremony that marks a life well built. She had never sat at the boardroom table. Today she sat at the boardroom table. Nathaniel was already there. He had arrived at 7:30, 2 hours before the meeting, and had arranged the documents and had spoken with Dr. Hayes Jackson's assistant and had done what Nathaniel Washington always did, the advance work, the quiet preparation, the setting of the stage so that the people who needed to stand on it could stand with full footing. Renata was beside her. Renata's presence was a specific kind of anchor, not warmth, exactly, though she was warm. Precision. The particular precision of a woman who had done this before and knew what it cost and knew what it was worth and had made peace with both. The 6-member board of Meridian Airways filed in. 4 men and 2 women, ranging in age from 50 to 72. They had known Booker Washington Sr. Some of them had known him personally. Dr. Hayes Jackson had attended his memorial. The other woman on the board, a woman named Celestine Dupree, who had run Meridian's legal department for 15 years before retiring to the board, had been hired by Booker Washington Sr. personally in 1988, at a time when that hiring was not a simple or unremarkable thing. They looked at Camille the way people look at someone they have always known but are only now seeing in the full specific light of who that person actually is. Pierce Global's delegation came through the door 2 minutes after Camille was seated. Sterling first, then Reginald, then two attorneys in dark suits carrying briefcases with the careful posture of men who had been told this meeting was going to require their best work. Sterling walked into the room and saw her. His step faltered. It was so small. It would have been invisible to anyone who was not watching for it. But she was watching for it, and she saw it, the fraction of a second hesitation of a man who has encountered something he was not prepared for, who is recalculating in real time. He recovered. He took his seat across the table from her. Reginald looked at the seat designation card in front of her. The card read, Camille J. Washington Pierce, controlling trust shareholder. Reginald looked at Sterling. Reginald said quietly, Sterling. Sterling said equally quietly, I see it. I kept his secrets and he sold mine. She said it inside, for the second time, the same truth but carrying different weight. The first time she had said it, it had been a wound. It had ached the way wounds ache, with all the rawness of something freshly cut. Now she said it the way you state a fact that you have finished being surprised by, the way you enter evidence into a record. He had sold her secrets to no one. She understood that. He had not traded them for anything so deliberate as money. He had simply used them, quietly and without acknowledgement, the way people use things they have never properly counted as theirs. He had used her community and her credibility and her family's legacy, and her quiet, steady presence in rooms where steady presence was the difference between trust and suspicion, and he had used all of it without ever saying, this is yours, not mine. I borrowed this, I should say so. Dr. Gwendolyn Hayes Jackson called the meeting to order. Dr. Hayes Jackson was 71 years old. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, the daughter of a civil rights attorney who had marched with Dr. King, and she had spent her entire professional life in the specific company of people who understood what it meant to build things under conditions that were not designed for your success. She had a doctorate in business administration from Clark Atlanta University, which was what Atlanta University had become in 1988, and she had been on the Meridian board for 19 years, and she was not impressed by money. She had seen too much money fail too many people with too much potential to be impressed by money. She was impressed by character. She was impressed by preparation. She looked at Camille. She said, as controlling shareholder, you have not previously attended a board meeting. We are glad to have you here. Do you have questions? Camille said, yes. She opened the notepad on the table in front of her. She had folded it into her purse the night before between her grandfather's letter and her grandmother's church fan, the 3 documents she carried into the most important room she had ever walked into. She said question 1. What safeguards exist in the current partnership proposal to ensure that Pierce Global's use of Meridian Terminal access does not create an operational dependency that limits Meridian's ability to negotiate with other carriers, or 2. Revise terms of the partnership in future periods? The 2 attorneys looked at each other. The board members looked at Dr. Hayes Jackson. Dr. Hayes Jackson looked at Camille. She said, please continue. Camille said question 2. Pierce Aviation Holdings, a limited liability company incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago, lists Reginald Deshawn Baines as registered agent and cites asset acquisition in the aviation sector as its business purpose. Can the board confirm that this entity's relationship to the proposed Pierce Global partnership has been reviewed and that the board has assessed its potential impact on Meridian's controlling interest? The room went quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people who are understanding all at once that the meeting they came to is not the meeting they are in. Reginald Baines' face did something complicated and then stopped doing anything. Sterling looked at the table. Camille said question 3. Is the board aware that a fidelity clause in the marital contract between myself and the chief executive officer of Pierce Global Logistics, which has been publicly and documentably violated, as documented in video evidence viewed by more than 140,000 people, and in additional documentation held by my attorney, has implications for the equitable distribution of Pierce Global's marital assets, including the value accrued through this proposed partnership agreement, which is currently the subject of an active legal proceeding. Dr. Hayes Jackson looked at her legal counsel. She looked at Celestine Dupree. She looked at Camille. She said, I think we should take a 15-minute recess. Camille said, of course. She closed her notepad. She walked to the restroom. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way her grandmother had taught her in a moment she had described simply as, "Sometimes emotions are bigger than your body, and the cold water helps your body remember it is in charge." She looked in the mirror. She recognized herself. Not because she looked different, because she looked fully present, because the woman in the mirror was standing in her own story instead of in the margins of someone else's. She dried her hands. She straightened her dress. She walked back into the boardroom. In the hallway, Sterling caught up to her. He said, "Camille, how long have you known? About what was yours?" She said, "Since my grandfather wrote me a letter before I was born. He knew before I did." He said, "Camille, I need you to understand," she said, "Sterling, I am not going to use what I have to destroy you. I am going to use it to protect what my grandfather built and what is best for our child. If your expansion proposal is genuinely good for Meridian, it will proceed on terms that protect Meridian. If it is not good for Meridian, it will not proceed. That is the end of the analysis. This is not personal. This is business. You taught me how to say that." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I did." She walked back into the boardroom. She sat down at the table. She waited. The recess ended. She had managed to do the hardest thing. She was not afraid of a single person in that room, not the attorneys, not Reginald, not Sterling, not even the weight of her grandfather's name in the building he had chosen for the view of where he came from. She was not afraid. She was the controlling shareholder of Meridian Airways, and she was in the room and she was asking the questions. And that was, in the most fundamental sense, exactly what her grandfather had always intended. When the elevator opened in the lobby and she stepped out, there was someone waiting. Jade Brooks was sitting in the lobby chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, looking like a woman who had finally stopped running from a thing she had been running from for a while. She stood up when she saw Camille. She said, "I know you do not want to see me. I know I do not deserve to be here. But there are things you need to know about what he told me, and I am not going to let him use me as a shield for what he did." Jade Brooks was 27 years old. She had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, in a family where college was not a given but was expected if you expected anything of yourself. She had worked 3 part-time jobs through Tennessee State University. She had graduated with honors in finance with a minor in logistics operations, which was an unusual combination that had impressed exactly the right person when the right person was looking for a director of corporate strategy for a growing freight company 3 years after Jade graduated. She had walked into her interview at Pierce Global Logistics with her resume and her case studies, and her specific, unusual knowledge of freight economics in the American South, and Sterling Pierce had hired her on the spot and told her she was going to help build something that mattered. She had believed him. She had believed him entirely and without reservation, because she had needed to believe someone like that was real. Someone who saw what she had and could do with what she had and was prepared to give her the space to do it. She had come from a family that believed in talent and work, and that had also just as firmly believed that talent and work were not always enough on their own. That sometimes you needed someone with a door to open it for you, and that when they opened it, you walked through with everything you had and you did not waste it. Sterling Pierce had opened the door. She had walked through. She had not known for 16 months that the door was also the door to something she would not have walked through if she had understood what she was walking into. Not the affair. She had made that choice with open eyes, or what she had believed were open eyes. But she had made it inside a story Sterling had told her, a story that she was only now understanding was not the true story. He had told her the marriage was over. He had told her specifically, deliberately, over multiple conversations across multiple months, that Camille had known for a year, that they had agreed privately to separate after the baby was born, that the pregnancy was planned before the separation decision, and that Camille had been clear that she wanted to raise the child primarily, and that Sterling would be involved, but that the marriage itself was functionally finished. He had told her that they were staying together through the pregnancy for appearances, because the community would not understand, and because it was the right thing to do for Camille's sake during a difficult time. He had told her this with the calm, direct eye contact of a man who was telling the truth. He had told her this on multiple occasions when she had had doubts. He had told her this in emails she had printed and kept because something in her needed the documentation. She could not have told herself then why she needed it. She knew now. She had found out 2 weeks ago. The Pierce Global holiday party. She had gone because Sterling had told her it would be awkward if she did not attend, because her absence would require explanation, and because she had been integrated into the company's social life in ways that made her absence conspicuous. She had gone. Camille had been there. Camille, 7 months pregnant, in a blue dress, standing next to Sterling at the welcome table, her hand in the crook of his arm. Not the hand of a woman whose marriage was over in every way that mattered. Not the posture of a woman who had agreed to a separation and was simply performing a marriage for the community. The hand and the posture of a woman who thought she was at her husband's company party because she was his wife. Sterling had touched her back when he introduced her to someone. The small, habitual touch of a man in the presence of his wife. Not a performance. A habit. Jade had stood across the room and watched and understood that she had been told a story. She had left the party early. She had spent 2 weeks with what she knew and what she was going to do with it. She had made the decision the night before the Meridian board meeting. She said all of this to Camille in the small conference room on the 14th floor, with Renata Holloway sitting beside Camille and a glass of water in front of each of them. She said it plainly, without editorializing, the way someone tells a story they have decided to stop being ashamed of in favor of being honest about. She said, "I have screenshots of texts in which he explicitly tells me the marriage is ending, and that you are aware of it. I have voicemails. I have 3 emails from his personal account. I am prepared to provide all of them in a legal proceeding." Renata said, "I will send you the documentation request in writing by the end of today." Jade said, "Send it. I will have everything to you by Friday." She looked at Camille. She said, "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not asking you to think well of me. I am telling you what he told me because you deserve to know the full story, and because I am not going to sit in that company and be used as a reason why this was your fault when it was never your fault." She said it carefully. Not as an apology, as a correction of the record. My mother did not raise me to disappear inside somebody else's name. Camille heard it inside, in the declarative voice, as she looked at the woman across the table who had been a party to the worst thing that had happened to her, and who was also, in this moment, doing one of the more honest things anyone had done in this entire situation. My mother did not raise me to disappear inside somebody else's name. She had spent 6 years allowing herself to exist in the margins of Sterling's narrative. She had been the grace note in his story, the beautiful and composed wife whose presence added texture and legitimacy to his public self, and she had been in those margins willingly, lovingly, with the genuine belief that a marriage was a shared story and that standing at the edges of his gave him room to grow into the man she believed he was capable of becoming. She saw now that she had been writing herself out of her own story. Her mother had not raised her to do that. Gloria Washington had worked in public school classrooms for 32 years, calling 30 students by their right names every day, making sure every one of them understood they had a story worth telling. She had raised 2 daughters to understand that your name was yours and nobody had the right to define it for you. Camille said to Jade, "I hear you, and I appreciate you being here." This was the most she could give. It was honest and it was enough. Jade nodded. She stood up. She said, "I am resigning from Pierce Global today." She left. Renata looked at Camille. She said, "Are you all right?" Camille said, "I am." She said it the way she had been saying things, without the question in it. She thought about the church ladies at Monday evening prayer circle. She had gone the night before, quietly, sitting in the back row of the small prayer room at Greater Faith. Most of the women there had been coming to that prayer circle for 20 years. They knew her. They knew her grandmother. They knew the story in the way communities know things, not through gossip, but through the accumulated weight of witness. Deaconess Marvella James had taken her face in both hands at the end of the prayer circle. The way she took faces in her hands when she needed to deliver something directly. She had looked at Camille for a moment. She had said, "You are going to be magnificent, baby." She said it the way 72 years of watching people survive things makes a person say things, with the specific certainty of someone who has seen the outcome before the person living it has. Camille had smiled. The smile had been real. She was going to be magnificent, not because of Jade's documents, or the trust documents, or the board meeting, or the legal strategy Renata was building with the careful precision of an architect working from blueprints she had been refining for 20 years. She was going to be magnificent because she was Ernestine Washington's granddaughter, and she was in the room, and she had stopped being afraid of the room. That was the whole of it. The counterproposal took Renata and Nathaniel 48 hours to draft. Camille had sat with them for portions of both days, reading drafts, asking questions, suggesting language in the clauses that related to Meridian's operational independence because she had spent a week reading the airline's annual reports and board minutes and understood now, at a level she had not previously brought herself to understand, what her grandfather had built and what it was worth and what it needed to remain itself. It was worth more than Sterling knew. Not in the way he measured things, though even in his terms it was significant. It was worth more in the other way, the way that did not appear on a balance sheet. It was worth the 1974 faith of a man who bought a second-hand turboprop with money he had to argue 3 banks into lending him. It was worth the 25 years of books that Ernestine kept without her name on any of the documents. It was worth the 1,000 employees, most of them black, who had built their lives and their families around a company that had been built specifically for and by them. It was worth the routes to destinations that mattered to communities that other airlines had not found worth serving. It was worth the HBCU students who had flown on Meridian to interviews and graduations and first jobs and homecomings because the airline existed, and because the fares were fair, and because Booker Washington Sr. had made a decision in 1974 that the fact of his people deserved to go somewhere was sufficient reason to build a way to get them there. Sterling had seen a logistics hub. He had seen terminal access and route networks and the specific strategic advantage of an established carrier in the markets he needed to enter. He had seen it as an asset. He had not seen what it was. Camille had seen it now. She had been seeing it for a week, page by page, in the annual reports and the board minutes and the photographs on the walls of the 14th floor offices. She had been seeing it in her grandmother's kitchen and in her grandfather's letter and in the weight of the trust document that had been waiting in a manila folder for 7 years, for the moment she was ready to pick it up. She had picked it up. The counterproposal offered Pierce Global limited terminal access under a 5-year agreement with independent annual valuation of Meridian's contribution. It included quarterly performance reviews with full termination rights if performance benchmarks were not met. It included a buyout protection clause, preventing any party from acquiring more than 5% of Meridian's outstanding shares without the written consent of the controlling shareholder. It revised the financial terms to reflect the actual market value of what Meridian was providing, which was, in Renata's forensic economist's analysis, significantly more than what the original proposal had offered. It included a conflict of interest declaration, formally entered into the board record, noting that the controlling shareholder and the chief executive officer of Pierce Global Logistics were parties in an active divorce proceeding. The counterproposal was fair. Camille had made sure of that over Renata's initial instinct to push harder. She had said it needs to be fair, not generous, not punitive, fair, because I am not doing this to hurt him. I am doing this to protect what my grandfather built and to make sure that what comes next for this airline is decided by me on my terms in my grandfather's building. Renata had said, all right, fair it is. The counterproposal was also the end of Pierce Aviation Holdings. The buyout protection clause made the acquisition play structurally impossible. Sterling could not acquire controlling interest in Meridian through the slow, patient strategy he had designed, because the controlling shareholder had now exercised her rights explicitly and publicly and in a board record that was not going away. Pierce Aviation Holdings would need to be dissolved. There was nothing else for it to do. Sterling's attorneys responded formally through Renata. They accepted the terms. Sterling texted Camille directly that evening. He said, the proposal is fair. I know that. Thank you for not burning it down. She read it. She did not respond. She showed it to Dominique. She had driven to the salon after the board's acceptance came through, which was what she did when something happened that needed to be processed in the right room. The salon was her right room. Dominique read the text. She looked at Camille. She said, that man just thanked you for not destroying him. She said it with the specific inflection that Dominique used when something was so comprehensively absurd that the only appropriate response was to name the absurdity plainly. Camille said, I know. Dominique said, girl. They sat with that for a moment. Then Dominique said, what do you want your life to look like? Not what you are legally entitled to. Not what Renata says you can get. What do you actually want? Camille sat in the back chair, the one she had been sitting in since she was 8 years old, and she looked at the product shelves organized by type and alphabetically within type, and she thought about the question. Really thought about it. Not the defensive version of the question, not the version that said, what can I salvage from this? The open version. The version that said, if you could build it from where you are standing, what would it look like? She said, I want my daughter to know her great-grandmother. I want to go to Howard board meetings without asking anyone's permission or adjusting my schedule around someone else's. I want to sit in the Meridian boardroom and know what I am voting on and understand what I am protecting. I want a front porch in Cascade Heights, near enough to walk to Big Mama's house in the morning. I want to press my hair on Friday nights and not feel like I am stealing time. She said, I want to be recognizable to myself. Dominique said, okay, let us build that. She found her old journal that week. She had been looking for something in a storage box at her parents' house, a box she had moved from the Buckhead house when she left it, and she had found it under a stack of graduate school notebooks, the journal she had kept the year before she met Sterling, the year she was 25 and fresh from her MBA program and working at a community investment firm in Southeast Atlanta, and living in a one-bedroom apartment in Edgewood where the upstairs neighbor played gospel music every Saturday morning. She sat on her parents' guest room floor and she read herself at 25. She did not recognize her, not because the handwriting was different or the references were dated, because the woman in those pages had not yet learned to edit herself. She was impulsive in her opinions and specific about her desires and direct about what she wanted and unapologetic about what she did not want. She was afraid of some things, of making the wrong choices, of being ordinary, of not becoming the person she could see herself capable of being, but she was not afraid of herself. She was not apologizing for the space she took up. Camille did not recognize the woman in those pages, but she loved her. She loved her with the specific fullness of someone who understands that person was the origin of who she still was underneath everything she had added and adjusted and smoothed over in the years since. She would like to find her. She would like to hold her. She would like to tell her, you were enough. You were always enough. Everything you built on top of who you already were was fine, but it was not necessary. You were already enough. My children will not grow up thinking a man's silence is the same thing as safety. She said it to the room and to the journal and to the daughter not yet born and to herself. She meant it. Booker Ernestine Pierce Washington was coming. 6 weeks from now, approximately, barring the unpredictability of newborns who had their own sense of timing. She was going to enter a world where her mother had stood at gate C7 and counted and breathed and stayed on her feet. Where her mother had walked into a boardroom and sat at a table that had always been hers and asked the questions that needed to be asked. Where her great-grandmother's name was in her own name because Ernestine Washington had arranged a trust in 1974 with the specific intention that her granddaughter would never have to earn the right to a table she already owned. Booker Ernestine was going to know all of this. Not as a lesson, as the story of the family she came from. The pieces were falling into place. Her pieces. Not the pieces of a life she had built around someone else's blueprint. Hers. The ones that had always been there, waiting for her to come and collect them. The Atlanta Tribune business reporter's name was Marcus Elliott. He had been covering the Pierce Global Meridian partnership story from the logistics beat for 3 months, following it as a business story about a major freight company's regional expansion strategy. He had written 2 pieces already, one about the Caribbean Corridor Plan and one about Pierce Global's growth trajectory. They had been straight business reporting, careful and accurate. When the conflict of interest declaration was entered into the public Meridian board record on Friday morning, a legal requirement under Georgia corporate governance rules, one that Renata had known was coming and had prepared Camille for, Marcus Elliott connected the dots between the board record and the viral video and the Washington family name on the Meridian trust document. He called Nathaniel Washington for comment on Friday afternoon. Nathaniel said, "My father built Meridian for this community. My daughter has always been its future." He knew that the moment he met her. He called Dr. Hayes Jackson for comment. Dr. Hayes Jackson said, "The Washington family's trust in Meridian Airways has always been the foundation of this company. We are pleased to have Miss Washington Pierce's direct engagement as we chart the airline's future." Sterling's publicist sent a statement. It was 3 sentences long, and it said the things that statements say when the person they represent has run out of moves. It acknowledged a period of personal difficulty, expressed commitment to the company's continued growth, and requested privacy for the family. The Tribune published the story on Wednesday morning. Camille was sitting at her parents' kitchen table with her coffee when she read it on her phone. The headline said, "Meridian Airways controlled by billionaire's wife in ongoing divorce." She read it 3 times. She called Dominique. She read her Dr. Hayes Jackson's quote. She read her father's quote. She read the section about Booker Washington Sr. and the founding of Meridian and the banks that had said no and the man who had said yes to himself anyway. They laughed for 5 minutes. It felt like breathing after holding her breath for 11 days. Like the specific physiological release of something that had been held too long, finally being allowed to move. She laughed until her eyes watered, and the baby kicked in what felt like protest, and she laughed at that too. And Dominique laughed on the other end of the phone. And outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood went on being the neighborhood, entirely indifferent to the specific hilarity of 2 sisters laughing at the moment when the truth has finally finished being held inside and has walked out the door on its own. Greater Faith African Methodist Episcopal Church's Sunday bulletin that week included a note from Pastor Jerome Caldwell. The note celebrated the legacy of Brother Booker Washington Sr. and affirmed the dignity and strength of the women in the congregation and in the city. It said that the church's prayer chain would remain active in support of the members of this community currently navigating difficult seasons. It did not mention Sterling Pierce by name. It did not need to. Sterling was not in church that Sunday. Lavinia Pierce called Camille on Saturday morning. She said, "I called Sterling's pastor in Buckhead, the one he started going to 2 years ago when Greater Faith became too familiar. I told him that his son needs to stop treating my granddaughter's grandfather's airline as a business opportunity and start treating it as what it is, which is a legacy that my son does not have the right to touch without my daughter-in-law's blessing." She paused. She said, "I also told him that if Sterling is not back at Greater Faith by the first Sunday of next month, he is not welcome in my home for Thanksgiving." She said, "I am sorry it took me this long to say what I should have said months ago." Camille said, "I know." She said it simply, without bitterness, which was not forgiveness exactly, but was something in that direction, something moving that way. Reginald Baines called Renata on Wednesday afternoon. He said he was prepared to cooperate with the divorce proceedings. He was prepared to provide documentation regarding the formation of Pierce Aviation Holdings and the discussions about acquisition strategy that had occurred between himself and Sterling over the past 14 months. He was prepared to be deposed. In exchange, he wanted assurance that his position at Pierce Global would be protected in any settlement terms and that his name would not appear prominently in any public filing. Renata said she would present those terms to her client. She called Camille. Camille said, "What does this cooperation give us that we do not already have?" Renata said, "The acquisition strategy in writing, emails and meeting notes going back 14 months, the paper trail of intent." Camille said, "Does it change what we can get in the settlement?" Renata said, "It makes the settlement negotiations significantly easier, less contested, faster." Camille said, "Then accept the terms." Sterling called on Thursday morning. She answered because she had decided that she needed to hear what he said when he had nothing left to bargain with. When the magazine covers and the board meetings and the expansion strategy and the shadow company and the other woman had all been laid out on the table in the light, and he had nothing left to hide behind. He said, I do not know how we got here." She said, "I do. And I think somewhere, so do you." She was quiet for a moment. She was sitting on the front steps of her parents' house in the October morning, coffee in hand, watching the street, the fig tree in the backyard, the neighbor's dog walking on the sidewalk, the ordinary morning of a neighborhood that did not know it was witnessing the final chapter of something. He said, "Is there anything I can do?" She said, "Get yourself right for your daughter. That is the only thing I want from you." She hung up. She sat on the front steps and finished her coffee. "I was quiet for years. I am done being quiet." She said it to herself in the voice that had been getting clearer for 11 days, getting more like her own, getting less like the edited version she had offered to rooms that had not deserved the full one. She was done being quiet. Not because being quiet had been wrong. There was a time for quiet. There was a time for the particular patience and preparation that her grandmother had modeled her entire life. There was a time to wait for the right hand before you showed your cards. She had waited. She had prepared. She had shown her cards at the right time and in the right room, and the table had responded the way the table responds when the right person is holding the right hand. She was done with the other quiet. The quiet that protected his comfort at the expense of her truth. The quiet that managed his perception at the cost of her clarity. The quiet that had been called consideration and had also been, she could admit it now, fear. She was not afraid anymore. She went inside. She had a settlement meeting to prepare for. They sat across from each other for the last time as husband and wife in a conference room that smelled like fresh coffee and old money. And Camille Washington looked at the man across from her and chose to be fair. She could have chosen otherwise. The prenuptial agreement's fidelity clause had been activated. Renata had filed the documentation the previous week, the video, the hotel receipts from Lavinia's envelope, the communication records that Jade had provided, the Pierce Aviation Holdings Incorporation documents, the emails from Reginald's cooperation. The documentation was thorough and, from a legal perspective, decisive. The fidelity clause voided the prenuptial agreement's protective provisions. The protections Sterling had built around Pierce Global were no longer operative. He was, legally, significantly more exposed than he had planned to be. Camille had the power to make this very difficult for him. She chose not to. She had made this decision alone, in the twin bed of her parents' guest room at 2 in the morning, sitting with the options the way she sat with the hard decisions of her life, in quiet, without performing the deliberation for anyone. She had thought about what her daughter would grow up, knowing about how her mother handled this. She had thought about what it would mean for her daughter to know that her mother had chosen grace, not because she was weak, but because she was clear. Because she understood the difference between justice and vengeance, and she wanted the former and would not dignify the situation with the latter. She had thought about what her grandfather's letter had said. The most powerful thing is not money. It is leverage she does not have to use. She was using it. But she was using it to build, not to burn. Renata and Sterling's attorneys had been in discussion for 3 weeks. The terms that were on the table today had been arrived at through careful, deliberate negotiation, the kind that Renata conducted with the precision of someone who was not interested in winning points but in landing correct outcomes. Meridian Airways was confirmed as separate property. The trust's pre-existence to the marriage, its establishment by a third party, and the explicit documentation of Booker Washington Sr.'s intent made this legally clear. Pierce Global Logistics was a marital asset. Camille's contributions had been valued by the forensic economist at $2.3 million. This was a conservative valuation, Renata had said. The actual economic impact of what Camille had brought to Pierce Global's success was higher. But conservative was what would hold up, and holding up was what mattered. She was not asking for $2.3 million. She was asking for what was right. A settlement figure that would fund her daughter's education through graduate school. A scholarship at Howard University in her grandfather's name. The establishment of a community investment office within Meridian Airways, funded through the settlement. That would be her professional work for the next decade, directing capital and expertise toward Black-owned small businesses in the communities Meridian served. She was asking for a future. Sterling's attorneys had pushed back on the Howard Scholarship initially, characterizing it as an unnecessary expense given that Camille had independent resources through the Meridian Trust. Renata had said, with the specific calm of someone who has heard everything, "My client's grandfather built a business that funded your client's expansion strategy. A scholarship in his name at his alma mater is not an unnecessary expense. It is an acknowledgement of what has been owed for some time. We are not negotiating this point." They had not negotiated it. The custody agreement was the part that had taken longest. Not because it was contentious, but because Camille had insisted on getting it exactly right. She had said from the beginning and repeatedly and without ambiguity that she would not use the child as leverage, that she would not use the child as a means of extending the conflict, that the child's relationship with her father was the child's right, and she was not going to stand in front of that right regardless of how she felt about the father. Their daughter would know both parents. Their daughter would spend time in Sterling's home and in Camille's home and in her great-grandmother's home and in Gloria and Nathaniel's home, and she would grow up knowing that the family that had always held things together was still holding, even when the shape of things had changed. The child's name was already decided. Booker Ernestine Pierce Washington. It had been decided the night Camille lay in the twin bed and made her vegetable soup at 4 in the morning and wrote her 3 questions on a notepad. The name would carry forward everything that mattered. It would tell the story every time someone said it. Sterling signed the settlement agreement. He signed it without theatrics, without the managed charm or the financial deflection or the father's voice that came out of his mouth when he was cornered. He signed it like a man who understood what he was signing. Renata gathered the documents. The attorneys on Sterling's side gathered theirs. Reginald caught Camille's eye across the table for a moment and looked away. Camille stood. She picked up her coat. She looked at Sterling across the table, for the last time as the husband she had loved, for the first time as the father of the daughter she was already raising alone. She said, "I hope you get where you need to be." She meant it. She said it plainly, without performance, without residual bitterness that she did not feel, because she had processed the bitterness in the twin bed and in the vegetable soup and in the 14 mirror moments and in 11 declarative truths she had said to herself in the dark. And what was left on the other side of all of that was not warmth but not cruelty either. It was clarity. She walked out of the conference room and into the elevator and stood in the glass elevator watching Atlanta spread out below her, and she thought about her grandfather looking out the east-facing windows at Hartsfield-Jackson. She could see the airport from here. She went to the restroom in the lobby. She ran cold water over her wrists. She looked in the mirror. She was present. She was standing in her own story. She dried her hands. She walked out of the building into the Atlanta afternoon. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the air, feeling the October cold on her face. The city around her, people going places, planes visible if you looked at the right angle, descending toward Hartsfield-Jackson. She thought, every one of those planes is coming into my grandfather's city. She thought, some of them are landing at his airport. She thought, some of them are operated by his airline. She walked to her car. She drove to Cascade Heights. She drove with the windows down even though it was November and cold. She needed the air on her face. She needed to feel present in her own body, in the specific tactile way that cold air on a face accomplishes better than most things. She needed the sensation of movement and weather, and the smell of Atlanta in November. That particular smell of fallen leaves and chimney smoke, and the city going on being itself in the particular way of cities in autumn when the heat has finally let go. She drove through Cascade Heights the long way. Not the fastest way, not the way she usually went. The way that went past the elementary school she had attended, and past the library branch where she had spent every summer of her childhood, and past the church where she had been baptized, and past the sandwich shop that had been on that corner since. Before she was born and was going to be there after everyone who knew her was gone. She drove the long way because she needed to be in the neighborhood before she was in the house. She needed to reacquaint herself with the ground, with the specific ground she had grown up on, the ground that had nothing to do with Sterling Pierce or Buckhead or Pierce Global or any of the geography for the last 6 years. This was her ground. This was where she came from. Ernestine Washington was sitting on the front porch in the rocking chair, blanket over her knees, coffee mug in her hand, wearing the heavy cardigan she wore in November, the burgundy one she had owned for so long that it had become a November smell, wool and cedar and her grandmother. She looked exactly like she was supposed to be exactly where she was. Camille parked the car and walked up the front path. She climbed the porch steps. She sat down in the other rocking chair, the one that had been on this porch since 1972. She said, "It is done." Big Mama said, "I know." She said, "How?" Big Mama said, "Renata called your father. Your father called me. I have been sitting here since this morning waiting for you." They rocked. The neighborhood sounds moved around them. A dog somewhere on the next block. A car radio passing on Cascade Road, something with a bass line, something that bounced off the old houses and was gone. Somebody's grandmother 2 doors down calling somebody's name out a window. Big Mama said your grandfather would be proud. She said it simply, not as a performance of sentiment, as a fact she had assessed and confirmed. Then she set down her coffee mug. She said, "I want to tell you something I have never told you. Not the Meridian story you know. A different part of it." Camille said, "All right." Big Mama said, "I was 22 years old when I married your grandfather. He was 24. He had a dream and faith enough for both of us and very little money and no plan B, which was the most terrifying and the most magnificent thing about him." She smiled. He had never had a plan B in his life. He considered a plan B an insult to the plan. She said, "I kept those books for 25 years. I made decisions that built the company. I sat in rooms where the decisions were made, and I made sure the right things were decided, and I did it all without my name on any document for 15 years. And when your grandfather finally put my name on the documents in 1989, he cried." He sat in the kitchen right there. She nodded toward the front door, toward the kitchen behind it, and he cried like I had never seen him cry because it had taken him 15 years to do something he should have done the first day. He said, "Ernestine, I am sorry it took me so long." I said, "Booker, it took you the time it took you, and we built it together regardless." He said, "It should have been different." I said, "Yes, but it was not. And we are still here." She said, "I was not resentful. I want you to understand that. I was not silent because I was afraid of him or because he asked me to be. I was strategic. In 1974 in Atlanta, Georgia, a black man had a better chance of getting a bank loan than a black woman. This was not a theory. This was a math problem. We did the math. We arranged ourselves accordingly. I was not shrinking. I was building." She said, "But I made one decision that was entirely mine. When it was time to arrange the trust, when your grandfather was getting his estate in order in the early 90s, I sat down with the estate attorney and I told him what I wanted. I told him that the controlling interest in Meridian Airways was going to be held by a woman, specifically by my granddaughter, who was not yet born but who I already knew was coming, because your grandmother told me, and your grandmother was never wrong about those things." She said, "I told your grandfather we built this together and we put your name on it because the world was not ready for mine. Our granddaughter is going to inherit something different. She is going to inherit something that is already in her name before she has to prove anything to anyone. She will not have to earn the right to the table. She will be born to it." Camille listened. She could feel the weight of it. Not heavy in the way of burden, heavy in the way of gift. The weight of something real and substantial being placed in your hands by someone who has been carrying it for a very long time, she said. "You did that for me." Big Mama said, "I did it for you. And I did it for every woman in this family who came before you and could not have it. For your grandmother's grandmother who kept the books for a man whose name is on the building she built. For your great-grandmother who raised 7 children by herself and never asked for credit. For every woman in this line who held the thing together from the inside and never got to stand at the front of it." She said, "And I did it for every woman who comes after you. For little Booker Ernestine who is going to grow up knowing that the table was already set for her before she got there, not because someone gave it to her, Because someone who loved her arranged the world so that when she arrived, the world was more ready for her than it was for us. Camille's eyes were full. She did not let the tears come. She did not need to. The fullness itself was enough. The feeling of being so thoroughly and specifically loved across time by a woman who had arranged things on her behalf before she was born was enough. She said, "How did you know? When I would need it." Big Mama said, "I did not know when. I knew that there would be a when. That was enough to plan for." She picked up her coffee mug. She said, "The biscuits are inside." They went in. The kitchen smelled like every morning that had ever mattered. Biscuits and coffee and the cedar smell of the old house and the particular warmth of a room that had been used for living for 56 years. Gloria was there, sitting at the table with her own coffee. Nathaniel was at the counter with his. Dominique came out of the back hallway, still in her coat, having apparently arrived moments before Camille. Big Mama was telling a story. Not about Booker or Meridian or any document. About the time in 1968 she had driven from Atlanta to Nashville and back in one day because the church needed hymnals, and she was the only one with a car and a willingness to go that day. The story went nowhere important. It involved a wrong turn outside Chattanooga and a service station that did not have the right change, and a man at the Nashville warehouse who had given her extra hymnals because she had been so organized about what she needed and he had. Never seen anyone arrive with a list that specific. They laughed. The kitchen filled with the sound of it. "I do not need to be rescued. I have rescued myself before." She said it inside. When Big Mama said, "You did this, sugar. You should be proud," Camille said. Out loud, "I had help." But yes, I did. She had done it. She had stood at gate C7 and counted and breathed. She had flown to Miami and attended 2 hours of a board meeting. She had opened a manila folder at 6 in the morning in a twin bed. She had driven to Ernestine's house without calling. She had walked into Renata's office and told the story from the beginning, in order. And she had sat across from the board of directors of her grandfather's airline and asked 3 questions that had changed everything. She had done it. With the help of Ernestine's biscuits and Gloria's greens and Dominique's back chair and Renata's legal pad and Lavinia's envelope and Marvella's hands on her face and her grandfather's letter and her grandmother's trust and 14 mirror moments and 9 breathing room scenes and 11 declarative truths she had said to herself until she believed them. She had done it. The coffee her mother had taught her to make. Strong. 2 sugars. Heavy mug. She made it in Big Mama's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in late November, 6 weeks from her daughter's due date, standing at the stove in her socks, measuring nothing, knowing by feel. The smell of the coffee blooming in the kitchen. The sound of the percolator, the old one that had been on this counter since before Camille could remember. The particular weight of a heavy mug in both hands. She carried it to the front porch. The rocking chair was there. The blanket was there. The same burgundy wool one folded over the arm. She sat down. She pulled the blanket over her legs. She set the mug on the porch rail. She looked at the street. November in Cascade Heights, the fig tree bare. The oak in the yard across the road still holding some leaves, brown and stubborn at the edges, a dog somewhere on the next block. A child calling out in the yard 3 houses down. The ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a neighborhood that had been going on being itself since before anyone on this porch was born and would go on after everyone on this porch was gone. Camille sat in the rocking chair and she breathed. For the first time in what felt like years, she was not managing anything. She was not performing anything. She was not editing herself or assembling herself or composing the version of herself appropriate for the room she was in. She was just here. She thought about all the rooms she had been in over the past several weeks. The airport, the Miami hotel, her parents' kitchen at midnight, Big Mama's kitchen at 9 in the morning, Renata's office, the parking garage, Dominique's salon, the church sanctuary, the Meridian boardroom, the settlement conference room. She had been in all of those rooms as herself. Not the version of herself she had assembled for Sterling's comfort. Not the version that smoothed her edges and softened her truths and stayed in the margins of his story so he could feel like the center. The actual version. The one who asked 3 questions in a boardroom and meant all of them. The one who walked out of a restaurant and left the right amount on the table. The one who called her grandmother at 3:14 in the morning and said nothing, and was understood completely, the actual version. She was going to be doing a lot from that boardroom from now on. This week, as controlling shareholder of Meridian Airways, she was going to formally propose the HBCU travel initiative to the board's investment committee. Subsidized travel for first-generation college students at 12 historically black colleges and universities. Beginning with 6 schools in the American South, the schools her grandfather's original routes had served. Tennessee State, Spelman, Howard, Morehouse, Hampton. Southern University. Her grandfather had started Meridian because black people deserved to fly with dignity. She was going to make sure black students could get on the plane. This was the next thing, not the only thing. The next thing, which was all her grandfather had ever told her grandmother she needed to know. Just the next right thing. Just do the next right thing. And the one after that will show itself when it is ready. The front door opened. Dominique came out with her own coffee mug and sat in the chair beside her. She had spent the night in Ernestine's second guest room, which happened more often now, all of them drifting toward this house the way they always had in the times that called for gathering. They sat together in the November morning. Dominique said, "How are you feeling?" Camille said, "Like I am about to start something." Dominique said, "Good. That is the right answer." The door opened again. Gloria came out with a plate of biscuits from the batch she had made at 6 in the morning. She set it on the porch rail next to Camille's coffee. She went back inside without a word, which was entirely characteristic of Gloria Washington's particular language of love. The gesture was the sentence. The biscuit said, "I see you. I am here. This is what I can offer." Camille took a biscuit. She ate it slowly, tasting the butter and the salt and the way the inside was soft and the outside was exactly right. She thought about all the mornings of her life that had had this specific taste every Christmas, every Easter, every difficult Tuesday. The baby moved, a slow roll unhurried like someone settling in. Camille put her hand on her stomach. She said, "I know. We are almost there." A package had arrived at her parents' house the day before. From Sterling. She had recognized the handwriting on the return address. She had opened it at her parents' kitchen table. Inside was a frame. Inside the frame was a photograph, printed at 8 by 10, and it was a photograph she had never seen printed before because she had only ever seen it on someone's phone, passed around at an event years ago. It was from a charity gala, 4 years ago. She was standing near the edge of the room, her head thrown back, laughing at something someone had just said. Fully laughing, the kind that takes your whole face, the kind you cannot curate or manage because it arrives before you have time to make decisions about it. She was wearing the green dress from that year, the one she had loved and eventually put in storage because it did not suit the Buckhead social calendar's color requirements. She looked like someone who had every reason to be exactly where she was. The card inside the frame said, in Sterling's handwriting, "You should have this. You look like yourself." She had sat with that for a long time. This is not the end of my story. This is the end of his chapter in it. She said it quietly, on the porch, in November, to her daughter and to her grandfather and to the street and to no one in particular, and to the woman she was becoming and to the woman she had always been. She put the photograph on the guest room wall next to the Howard graduation photo. It belonged there. She rocked. She drank her coffee. She listened to the neighborhood, the dog, the child, the car radio that appeared briefly from somewhere and disappeared. Someone's grandmother calling someone's name out a window, the same thing that was always happening in this neighborhood, had always happened in this neighborhood, the ongoing evidence that someone was being looked for, and therefore loved. She thought about her daughter. She thought about Booker Ernestine Pierce Washington, who was going to arrive in 6 weeks or so, and would arrive knowing nothing, in the way that new people arrive knowing nothing, and are shaped by everything around them from the first breath. She was going to be shaped by this porch, by Big Mama's kitchen, by the fig tree in the backyard of the house her great-great-grandfather had built in 1968, by Gloria's greens on the stove on Thursday evenings, by Dominique's salon and the photographs of women on the walls, by the Meridian Airways boardroom where her great-great-grandfather's name was on the building and her mother's name was on the trust document, by the story, the whole story, all of it, the part that had been hard, and the part that was beautiful, and the part that had cost something, and the part that had given everything back. She was going to know what her grandmother had arranged before she was born. She was going to know what her great-grandmother had built, alongside a man whose name was on the door for 15 years while hers was not. She was going to know that the women in her family had always held the ground that others stood on, and that the holding was not invisibility. It was foundation, and that foundation is the most important part of any structure worth building. She was going to know that her mother had stood at gate C7 and counted to 90 and did not fall. The front door opened again. Gloria said, "You want dinner, baby." Camille sat for one more moment. She looked at the street. She looked at the fig tree she could see over the porch rail. She looked at the November sky, the particular color of Atlanta in November at 4 in the afternoon when the light is going gold and the air is cool and the city is settling in for the evening. She was more than ready. She knew it the way her grandmother had taught her to know things. By feel, by the specific weight of a thing in her hands, by the intelligence of a body that had been paying attention for 32 years and had finally fully been given permission to speak. She said, yes, I do. She picked up her coffee mug. She stood. She went inside. The door closed behind her, soft, deliberate, hers. Whatever came next, she was more than ready.